Why is creativity important? Why are innovations important? Why are inventions important?
Welcome to the Science of Creativity, your home for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Sawyer. My mission is to inspire you with stories of brilliant creators and world-changing inventions. You'll learn about the latest psychological studies and gain insights about creativity that will help you reach your full creative potential. I'm excited to have Dr. Kenan Sahin on the show today. Dr. Sahin is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the United States. His first company, Kenan Systems, was founded in 1984 with $1,000. When it sold in 1999 for $1.54 billion in stock, Dr. Sahin was the sole owner. I asked him to join us on the show because he's just published a book of advice for aspiring entrepreneurs. It's called Lean Startup to Lean Company to Rich Exit. Kenan, welcome to the Science of Creativity.
It is a great pleasure to be on this podcast to respond and expand on whatever questions you might have of me.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely. This is an incredible success. And when you grow a company to over $1 billion, I know that can only happen by creating value. And creating value is, at its heart, it's an example of human creativity. So I'll start by asking, what does creativity mean to you?
Well, Keith, I will bounce the question a little bit towards you. You mentioned that you were the fourth person to join the company, indeed so. And I remember interviewing you and immediately spotting creativity that you displayed. And as you know, I got going with what later on became Kenan Systems. At the beginning, it had an academic title that I had come up with. It was to see how one can translate and transform ideas, notions, theories, findings on creativity, innovation, invention, all kinds of related terms into one keyword that becomes the culmination of all of these related words, and that's implementation. That is harnessing the powers behind, let's call it collectively creativity cluster, into impact through implementation. So to respond to your question, not really an answer, because your question, I don't think, has a clear-cut answer. It's just a cluster of thoughts. I would say it is the implementation that becomes a key motivation and oftentimes the engine for the creativity cluster. So that connection I was missing explicitly when I was in academia covering all these topics, but did not really fully understand that the bigger engine than even creativity is implementation. And in trying to do the implementation, one obviously comes up with the topics, what I will call the agenda for creativity. Whereas when I was in academia, I thought the engine for creativity was inventions, but didn't realize the agenda topics really are much more powerfully derived from implementation. So here's some initial thoughts, Keith. And let's call each other by first names. I'm Kenan, as
course.
you know, you're Keith. Let's see where that gets us to.
Right.
Your turn.
We're such old friends. All the way back when we first met, I was not doctor anything. I was just an undergraduate degree, and you were much more senior, successful professor at, I believe you were a professor at MIT's Sloan School of Management. Isn't that right?
That's correct. That's correct. But I always went by Kenan, so we can go back to first name basis. Because as you know, an important culture, now that you brought up MIT, that is such a creative environment, is notion of everyone being equal before science and inquiry and discovery. And as you know, many professors are on a first name basis, and colleagues to and with even freshmen coming to MIT.
Right. Yeah, you're right. It would be it would contradict the idea of having a flat organizational culture if you were to refer to your supervisor so with an honorific like Dr. Sahin. Yes, you will always be Kenan to me, but but yes, now I am Dr. Sawyer many years later, and I take it to heart what you said about the key role of implementation. Invention is not sufficient, and a lot of my colleagues, psychologists who study creativity, we often focus on just the part of having the idea and don't think as much about the role of implementation. And that's actually one of my questions for you today is how do you get from invention? How do you get from creativity to a successful innovation? How do you think about that pathway?
Well, Keith, I think one of the factors that enlightened me was understanding that what I glorified when I was in academia, that is, inventions and innovations, was really a very small part of the journey to impact. So one can go back to purpose. Why is creativity important? Why are innovations important? Why are inventions important? There are many other things that one can spend time on, including enjoying oneself, watching a movie, entertaining, and being entertained. But I think ultimately, I would say we're all driven by purpose, meaning in life, and big questions like that. So, why engage in creativity? What's the driving factor? And at least one, not the full answer, but one answer is impact. To impact others, impact the environment, impact society for the better. Hopefully, for the better. It doesn't work out that way all the time, but for the better. So, if it's going to be impact, impact happens through implementation by others or by us participating in the implementation. So, as an academic, I had, I must say, a distorted viewpoint of that second part, implementation. I said, those people out there will do it. I have done the heavy lifting. I came up with way back, you don't know that part of me, in the 60s, started with neural networks, which got me into cellular automata, which got me into actually a fundamental patent on communication networks, which had the beginnings of the internet, decentralized response routing. And I felt so good. I said, well, others will do it. Well, that was one of the reasons why I migrated from academia to industry when, as I indicate in my book, both books, when I was confronted by someone who came from industry as a student in course of mine, Sloan Fellows, and these Sloan Fellows were actually accomplished executives, managers, doctors who had grappled with the so-called real world, but now were coming back to get retooled with theory to underpin what they were doing. And here I was, an enthusiastic academic, on my soapboxes. I had many of them, I still do, pontificating. And then I was startled when a voice boomed from the back of the class. He said, Kenan, that's just full of crap. And the whole class just froze. I mean, these were mid-level managers, executives. They had authority, obviously, in their own domains, but my goodness, this was MIT, this was a professor on a podium, and you just wouldn't challenge a person like that. And if you did, you would ask a polite question and not just confront him by saying, that's just full of crap. And I paused. And as you know, I don't mind such things. I take it on the chin and go on. Well, I sat down, and he actually later on became a CEO of a big company. I won't mention the company. I said, Don, you might be right. Let's discuss. Let's discuss this. And we had an open-ended discussion in the classroom. And my viewpoint seemed to resonate with some. Some indeed thought, although they didn't say so, that there were many weaknesses in my ideas. I mean, they didn't say it's full of crap. They pointed out some of the weaknesses. And that, Keith, just stuck in my mind. And one of those movies that the mind plays that never seems to go away. For many years, that would come back in my mind. It is just full of crap. So I said, Don is more right than wrong. I don't know. I mean, I've learned these things. I didn't test them. You don't have a laboratory necessarily in academia to test all these creative things. You might write a paper, you might run a survey, you might run, if it's physical sciences, maybe a short experiment in the lab. But these were big things. This is company engineering. This is creativity. This is pulling something out of thin air that you think might have an impact. So in due time, the doubt in me started growing at me. I said, how the hell do you know? I mean, is it really creativity that you're interested in? If that's so, just write some books, write some articles, and be done with that. I've done that. I published. So that's why I got into so-called industry, which sometimes is maligned in academia, and in return, industry maligns academia as people who live in ivory towers who are clueless about how things are really done. Now, I will inject a story to illustrate the key point I want to make. This story I grew up with. My father told it to me. There's a dispute, and the plaintiff and the defendant appear before a party, a neutral party. The plaintiff makes his case. It is so articulate, it is so crystal clear that the arbiter is overwhelmed and says, obviously, you're right. And then the defendant gets up. And it's just unbelievable. A defendant has even a more crystal clear case. So the arbiter gets even more overwhelmed and says, you're right. And his friend, who's hearing all of these things later on, meets with the arbiter and says, how can both sides be right? And the arbiter says, you're right too. And when my father told me this story, I said, that's an old man's story. It doesn't make any sense to me. But in life, I realized that is the essence of so much of what we do. It isn't to find people right or wrong, but finding everybody right, coming up with something that makes everybody right in their own mind, as well as, according to laws and so on and so forth. And as I went into the industry, I realized academics are right, the industry people are right, everybody is right, but people are seeing different parts of the proverbial elephant. The academics might see the trunk and view the elephant as a trunk. The people in industry see what comes out of the elephant, and they say that's how academia is, full of crap. Everybody is right, because at the end you have to look at the total picture, which brings me to the beginning comment I made, that creativity without implementation and impact is incomplete, and implementation and impact without creativity is incomplete. One has to look at the full chain. That's why at the end I felt compelled to write the two books. One was my own journey as I found my way through the implementation morass. And it's a morass when you're trying to get something really out there into the marketplace. The obstacles are unbelievable, far more than creativity, far more, and far more expensive, because you need other people, you need facilities, you need to pay rent, you need to deal with customers. Some of them are delightful, some of them are absolutely unbearable. And some give you bad habits. I mentioned that in the book. I say, be careful of the customers you choose, because the word customer has custom in it. You get your customs from your customers. And if you end up with a bad customer, you end up with bad habits, bad customs. And anyway, Keith, that's a story that I wanted to highlight, which proved to be so central to what I observed as I was making my journeys.
Well, I have to tell our listeners who might not know, when I said Dr. Kenan Sahin was one of the most successful entrepreneurs, and a lot of our listeners won't have heard your name, right? But everybody's heard of Elon Musk. Everybody's heard of Steve Jobs. So they're thinking, what does he mean? This is such a successful entrepreneur. But I have to say, back in, I believe it was 1999, when your company was sold to Lucent, it was the largest software company in Massachusetts. Now think about that. Massachusetts, one of the hubs of high technology, and you had that incredible success. I can't believe it. I've even read experts all over the country in innovation and entrepreneurship talking about the amazing exit, as we call it, when you sold your company for over $1.5 billion. How many entrepreneurs can talk about that? And that's what you call impact, right? To get from creativity to having an impact on the world. Yeah, and that's, I think, what everybody should want. This regional innovation ecosystem, you usually think about the university as the source of the creativity, right? The university researchers generate the ideas and the new patents, and then they sell them or transfer them out to, yes, what you call industry, right? The private sector. And then it's the private sector who does the implementation. But in your case, you're telling a story where you decided to leave the university because you weren't satisfied with just being the idea generation person. Is that right? You wanted to get out there into industry.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, you brought up why is it that I did not choose to be more visible? There were many other components. As you know, at the end, the software that you played a key role in, the software that eventually became the telecommunications backbone in so many ways, which was named as Arbor, and you again played a key role in that. And later on, after I left Lucent, apparently Lucent on its own changed it to Kenan billing platform, and now processes, I'm told, about a third of the global telecommunications subscribers. Now that's impact, and I am in the background, and that's the way I like it. It wasn't about me; it was about the impact. And Keith, the sale, need to comment on the sale a little bit so that your listeners understand. The sale was not about money, and I need to expand on that. And some of these things, very few people know, and you certainly don't know. I did not initiate the exit. Kenan Systems in 1999 had cash margins of 50%. And only I knew that, and just two, three other people in the company, because by that time, the board had become advisory. Howard Johnson, former president of MIT and chairman, even he didn't know. And I wanted to keep it under the radar and plow the money into distribution to the staff, as well as obviously investing and growing the company. But somehow the word got to Wall Street. You can't keep things that secret. So they were advised, Lucent was advised to seek us out. But it was a partly deceptive, their call to me. I took the call. I was told it was from Bell Labs and Lucent. And my aim at that time was to find partners, system integration partners. I had already was close to signing up Bellcore, which is not to be confused with Bell Labs. I'd signed up all the big names, IBM, Pricewaterhouse, Anderson Consulting, and so on. And this person said he was calling from Bell Labs and wanted to have a strategic relationship. And I should have been more inquisitive. But at any rate, when they showed up in limos, a lot of suits, and suddenly it became clear to me that they were coming to explore acquisition. And in fact, the group president, whom I later on replaced, Dr. Shu, came right down to the point and said they had made inquiries, they were very impressed. Bell Labs itself had a billing platform, but ours was basically a cut above. And it had been adopted by so many companies across the world. They wanted to acquire the company. And my response was, thank you very much. I'm complimented, but we have no interest. We're doing really well. So he was very disappointed. He said, do you know what you're refusing? I said, I'm a former business school professor. Of course I know. I know the multiples. I know the valuation is well above $1 billion, but I have no interest. We're doing fine. I mean, what do we do with the money? You invested in something. I said, we're already expanding at 50 to 70%. And we think we will be key players in not just telecommunications, but utilities and many other industries where what we're offering will be a backbone. So he went away, very disappointed, and I pushed on. And then I was in London, met with British Telecom, a client, and they told me how much they had embedded Arbor at that time. And then my next stop was France Telecom, and the CTO of France Telecom, who towered over me, he said, listen, Dr. Sahin, Failure is not an option. We're entrusting the entire revenue stream of French Telecom on this Arbor BP platform. And then I went to Telefonica in Spain, and he had a conference call with Latin American nations, their CTOs, and he was telling them the virtues of Arbor BP as a flexible, real-time system. And Keith, when I came back to London, I was 1 foot tall. I said, I'm lucky to have about 1,000 colleagues, amazing people. And here I am, the obstacle to their growth as well as the growth of the company. So I called up Howard Johnson. I said, Howard, it's not the money. I have 700 exceptionally talented technical colleagues. And I don't think I can take them any further. But if Lucent is willing to accept them into Bell Labs, then it makes a lot of sense. And Howard said, Kenan, come on now. Bell Labs, just to hire one person, takes them through many, many interviews. You're talking about 700 wholesale. Well, I said, Howard, that's what makes sense. So he said, I don't think it'll happen, but you call them. I called Carl Schuh. Carl said, Kenan, that's a tall order. Let me take it up with Dan Stanzion, president of Bell Labs. At that time, Bell Labs was at its height, and CEO of Lucent. And I'll reach him again, and I'll get back to you. But send me the resumes, and we will review them. And in fact, the CTO of Bell Labs is an MIT PhD, and we'll see. And Keith, I forgot about it. I just moved on. A month later, Carl called. He said, Kenan, to my amazement, they accepted it. So we're on. Let's negotiate. So Keith, I retained through Howard Johnson, JP Morgan. JP Morgan came with a valuation of $3 billion based on the market at that time, IPOs. Their recommendation was that I go with IPO and that I shop the company around. I said, don't you even dare do something like that. By the way, you're not even coming to the negotiations. I'm going to go do it with Howard, just the two of us. Because I said, it's not about money. This is about impact and having my colleagues be in an environment far more potent than Kenan Systems. I couldn't think of a better environment than Bell Labs. So Keith, that's how it happened. And actually, one might say I was very fortunate to have 1.5 billion as the exit, or one can say I was foolish in refusing a $3 billion market that supposedly, according to JP Morgan, I could have gotten. But I have absolutely no regrets. It was amazing. It was fantastic. And later on, I can tell you how I continued the impact at Bell Labs by establishing what we called Joint Development and Delivery Center. But I've already gone on too long. Let me stop.
Well, some of our listeners will be familiar with Bell Labs, but maybe most won't. Legendary innovation powerhouse going back, 1950s at least. And I think the book about Bell Labs, I highly recommend. I think it's called The Temple of Innovation or something to that effect. Just a 5,000, 4,000 employees. And as I was reading your book, The Lean Startup to Lean Company to Rich Exit, you have a section in there about when you acquired later, you actually became the head of Bell Labs, this legendary innovation powerhouse. And you talk about Bell Labs being split in two. It had one group of 1,000 people that was, I guess you could say, the creativity group that would come up with the wild and crazy ideas. And then it had another group that was the implementation group of about 4,000. And then you have this separation where I guess the creativity group generates the ideas, kind of like we're talking about the university, right? University professors. And then they hand off the ideas to this larger implementation group. And in your book, you talk about how ineffective that was. So what did you do to address that divide?
Well, the reason, Keith, I found out it was not as effective as it could be was the implementation group was funded by the 5 businesses that Lucent had. One of them being the communications group, which I eventually headed at Lucent on the business side. At Bell Labs, I was in a VP of software technology. Bell Labs obviously had a number of other components. The Bell Labs Advanced Technology Group, as they were called, the implementation team, had to sell what they were offering to different businesses, primarily. So it was an internal market. And under the competitive pressures that Lucent was now facing as an IPO'd company in 1993, I believe, 1994, together with Bell Labs, package was the most successful IPO up until that time. Facing the market competition and timelines in this fast-moving internet era, was not finding the offers coming from Bell Labs through advanced technologies attractive. And that, by the way, has been true across the board for many of our large companies. If you look at DuPont, if you look at GM, if you look at any of these big companies, at one time they had very large R&D groups, creativity groups. In due time, they were almost all discontinued because time to market was just too long for the CEOs. So they would rather buy a company that already had a product, already had revenue, already had the markets. So the dynamic of lack of receptivity in the internal market, which the five businesses were, was not unique, but it was bothersome. It was really bothersome. So I thought we could do something about it as Kenan Systems, especially when I became a group president and also as the VP at Bell Labs. So I went to, on the one hand, Dan Stanzio, on the other hand, to Rich McKinn. I said, I have the budget where our unit is doing extremely well. Can I set up a separate entity called Joint Development and Delivery Center? And I said, I will take 50 people handpicked from Bell Labs, 50 people from Kenan Systems, handpicked. One side will be this creativity part. The other side will focus on implementation. And since Kenan Systems has such a vast market, telecommunications market, internationally, we had more clients than Lucent had in Europe, in Asia. I said, we can introduce what we develop. And the combination worked, Keith, like a magic. I mean, we emptied a lot of the software kernels and Bell Labs in short order into many presentable offers to the vast telecommunications market. So that was in itself a big experiment and showed that if you bring together under one umbrella the creativity part and the implementation part and access to markets where you can make impact, I mean, it works like a charm. It works like a charm. So when I look at any number of the companies that have arisen in this century, the likes of Facebook and likes of Google, likes of Uber, and so on, I see those three components nicely coming together. A creativity engine coupled to an implementation engine, coupled to access to markets for impact. And then you create tremendous amount of value and opportunities.
Well, when I look around at the innovation literature, I see the same thing, really. Anytime a large company has one of these innovation labs, sometimes in a separate building, sometimes in a different city, and it often seems to fail because of, sometimes I'll call it the handoff problem, that the innovation group tosses their ideas over the wall to the implementation
right.
group, and that translation just is just too hard to do. So I like what you did. You put them together in the same unit that you call the Joint Development Center, but you had a smaller number of people. You said 50 and 50, about
50 and
100.
50.
So
Yeah.
50 and 50. So that seems more manageable. I mean, if you had put all 5,000, you can't put 5,000 people in one unit. So you need to have a smaller group, right?
Yes. Keith, there's entrepreneurship and there's intrapreneurship. And I've been experimenting with that at the current companies, TIAX and Chemex Power. And the environment I have been aiming to create, and I think it happened, was to have more of an intrapreneurship so that we can take early stage ideas and process them into offers for the markets in a seamless way. Even then, I run into these handoff issues because people in implementation have a different mindset of what is ready than people in the creative, let's call it the ecosystem. For people in the creativity, innovation ecosystem, something is finished when you can really articulate, describe the idea, the innovation, maybe have a prototype that kind of works on Monday and Tuesday. On Wednesday, it may have some issues, which means you have to get back and fix those things. And later on, I'll tell you a funny story about that. Whereas for people in implementation, and you know it all too well because you were, you moved from that creative space to implementation at Citibank, it has to work. I mean, if I buy my PC, it can't be 90% complete. It has to be really complete. It has to work and work every time, at least most of the time. If I buy a car off the showroom, it can't be that my next stop will be the repair shop for completing whatever is lacking in the car. That production concept is a different concept than creativity. If I have created a new engine design, I have the blueprints, I have all of those things. But implementation is not necessarily my obsession. So how do you bring these two together with a smooth handoff? And I don't think it has been satisfactorily addressed. There are many attempts. Some companies have the innovation group, then they have the pre-engineering group, then the design and implementation group, then the production group, and so on and so forth. But your point that you mentioned is a very astute one. If you make these teams too large, they don't couple together. And then in due time, under the financial pressures, under the quarterly, especially pressures, you begin to get siloing. The groups begin to focus on their efficiency, their output. So one of the advantages we had at Kenan Systems was we didn't have those pressures. We did not have investors. We did not have VCs. I had a board, a very powerful board, but the board was in so many ways not empowered, but I allowed them to be empowered. So as need be, I still could experiment. And at TIAX and Chemex Power, it's the same model. I don't have outside investors. And so we have been extensively experimenting with this coupling and handoff. As part of that coupling, let me give you an example. I remind my colleagues, they hardly do any financial paperwork. So they have maximum amount of time for this whole flow from beginning to end. But Keith, I think my key motivation in both books was when I, having completed the so-called rich exit, and I looked at the picture, I was very, I would say, disappointed because there is the legend, myth, not legend, goes around that 1 out of 10 companies, startups succeed. When I really, as a former academic, dug into the numbers, I was startled. It's more like 1 out of 10,000. I get challenged on that. People say, how can that be, Kenan? With all these companies all around. I said, there's a perception and there's the hard numbers. And you and I both have been in rigorous environments. It's very easy to have an impression. But then when you look at the hard numbers, that's when science becomes real. But the data says something very different. So that's why, I don't know if you can reference the article. In 2003, I wrote a short article that was published by Technology Review. The fundamental premises that have not changed, unfortunately, talking about our innovation backlog, that there is a big disconnect between our innovation engines and implementation engines. The implementation engines do not take enough innovations in. And I can go through a whole host of reasons. There has been, in some sense, decoupling between the innovation engines and company engines that implement. They don't take many of these innovations in. And there are a lot of startups that take these ideas into the marketplace, but it's like the seeds of a tree. I mean, this, for instance, TIAX, Arthur D. Little, and so on, there's this concept of acorns. Plant the acorns and you'll get an oak tree. But we both have stepped on acorns. Thousands of them coming out of one tree. And how many of them take root? It's lucky if one makes it, just one, to be the next oak tree. Oftentimes, when the season is over, the acorns fall on the ground, only to be fed for either squirrels or just rot away. And I don't want our innovation engines that. But when you look at the numbers, which I articulate in the, both books, painfully, in fact, I hesitated. I said, do I want to be the messenger of such stark stats. But I said, if we're going to do something about it, if we want to go from this enormous creativity that we have in our nation, by far the most creative nation on earth, to greater implementation, not that we're not implementing. I mean, look at all the companies, look at our impact, look at our gross domestic product, 4.5% of world population. That's why we are 330 million people versus 8 billion. We generate roughly $25 trillion as GDP. That's 25% of global GDP. No nation comes even remotely close. And last year, that engine grew at nearly 3%, which is even more remarkable. It's just remarkable, unbelievable. But we can do much better than that. I mean, the privilege for excellence is the opportunity to have even greater impact. I've always said that. So that's why, Keith, I outlined the grim stats in both books. And that's why we're having this conversation. I think we have many opportunities to vastly expand implementation. There's no limit to what can be done. This ChatGPT is showing us there are many, many instances like that.
Well, I heard two, way more than two, but two that stood out, two lessons from what you were just saying. And one is that if you have external investors or venture capitalists, that can block creativity and innovation. And you might say a little bit more about that. And then the second lesson I got was that if you have a smaller, flatter organization, that you're more likely to be creative. But then I'm thinking about your success, where when I left the company in 1990, there were maybe 60 or 70 people, and we had generated a lot of the innovations, including the Arbor billing system, which led to the 1.5 or $3 billion valuation. So a lot of innovations during that small phase of being 50 to 100 people. But then you grew the company in the 1990s to, I can't remember how much, 750, 1,000 people. Were you
About
able,
1,000.
were you able to retain, how could you retain that creative potential when you're no longer that 50 or 100 person company?
Keith, that's what I will call organizational engineering. And that's what I try to do at Bell Labs. Create, and we have, by the way, created in our country very successful companies. I will highlight, for instance, DuPont. At its height, DuPont had the creative components, the pre-engineering components, the implementation components, and the market impact components. And there were many other companies like that. DuPont is not alone. And one can argue General Motors did that. But there were some changes that happened in the dynamic of our economy and subsequently in this century in the whole ecosystem. Now, on the one hand, having external funding, VCs, is wonderful. It's great. I have nothing against that. But on the other hand, one forgets that VCs don't own the money they invest. It's someone else's money. And they have a fiduciary responsibility to get a return on that that is comparable to people's expectations of such risky investments. And that return hovers between 10 and 15%. And people are eager to get that in a relatively short amount of time. They don't want to wait 15 years, 20 years. A lot of them are advanced in their years. They may die in 10, 15 years. So how do you reconcile timeframes, especially in hard sciences, for instance, in material sciences, which I'm in now? It takes about 15 years and close to $100 million to develop just one material. In the pharma industry, same thing. You look at 10,000 molecules, you're lucky if 5 of them eventually come to a marketplace. And these investments are vast. But in most of the investments, people want reasonably quick returns. So that means when you have a board with the investors on the board, they put pressure, as they should, on the whole system to go from innovation to implementation roughly within 5 years. And if you're not going to make it, they say we're stopping. So those who achieve the quickest maturation to market get more funding, and they evolve to be the Google's giants. But most fall by the wayside. And that's what bothered me. And also the factors, I'll get into a little bit into regulation, the factors that promote competitiveness also have decreased. So once companies reach what I call greenfields, they become. I mean, I remember meeting Larry Page in 2003. The company had about 150, 200 people. And now Google buys companies. They just soak them in. And many of these companies do that. But they can't buy 1,000 companies a year. They buy a few. What happens to the rest? So that's why in the book I mentioned these numbers, roughly 5 million startups, and very few of them make it to the finish line. We have to improve the odds, Keith, but size might be one obstacle, although I think one can deal with that. Communication networks are much more efficient. Zoom has shown us ways of creating virtual companies of thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. And also, I think there are many more tools of company engineering. I'm thinking of writing several other books that are much more conceptual, much more framework oriented. One being how to have a large company that is like a small company, Keith. And that's what you're talking about. How can one have a Kenan Systems at 1,000 that if you were to come back to the company after you left when it was 60, 70 people, you will say the look and feel is the same. I think that can be done. And that would be a very effective company that really combines these different ecosystems of creativity to implementation to market impact.
Well, I think you're going to have a big impact with your books. And of course, your first book is 2024. That's why we're here. It's called Lean Startup to Lean Company to Rich Exit. And then your second book is a follow on to that with a similar title, but it's called The Guidebook. And I was wondering, of course, when I heard the term Lean Startup, I think a lot of people are going to think about the book called Lean Startup from 10 or 15 years ago and the associated with the idea of the minimum viable product or MVP. Was that your intention when you put Lean Startup in the name of your book?
Well, Keith, actually, in an indirect way, I was trying to address the very topic that we're discussing now, which is can one do it alone, at least for a stretch of the way? The standard model, let me go back to the 1980s. I, of course, did want it to be a lean startup because my objectives were different. My objectives were more experiment in the marketplace. And I didn't want to take someone else's money and use it for my own field experiment. But right now, when there is a startup, if you look at the business school dogma, you have an idea, you have a technology, and then you try to create your 10, 15, 20 slide PowerPoint and go from VC to VC to VC, from one source of funding to another. And eventually, if you're lucky and if you meet certain criteria and so on, you end up with one. And when I talked to a VC, when I told him that the odds that I'm computing are far, far worse than what they promote, first he pushed back and then he agreed. He said, yes, we tend to fund 1 out of 10, but I know before people come to us, there's already a down select of 1 out of 10. So already they are beginning with 1 out of 100. And then he said, you're also right, because of the 10 we accept, we think one will succeed. So already you're at 1 out of 1,000. Just those three numbers, Keith. And so I wanted to get across by saying lean startup, you don't need to go begging for funds. Why don't you use your creativity, but not in technology creativity, in organizational creativity, in recruiting creativity, in marketing creativity, in sales creativity? And if you put these things together, maybe you can get going. And if you can get going, then it becomes a self-fueling kind of engine. You don't have a perpetual engine, but you could have a substantially self-financing engine. And then you can apply many more ideas because substantially it's the funds that you're generating. So you don't have to worry about fiduciary responsibility as much. So that's what I really wanted to get at by saying lean startup, as opposed to a rich startup. When you have a business plan, you get $10 million, $20 million funds pledged to you, and you spend a lot of it in finding fancy offices and hiring a lot of executives. You hire your VP of this, VP of that. That's a rich start. Not that it's bad. I'm not condoning that. But That's a very different way of Keith getting going. And this is a contrast.
Yeah, in the real world, most people start with no money, like you, the famous version of your story where you started with $1,000. And I had to smile a few minutes ago when you referred to your company and building the company and its success. I think you referred to it as a field experiment. uh, so everything you've done in your career is as a test of the academic theories, I suppose. Is that the way you'd put it?
That's the way it is, Keith. It still is that way. I mean, I'm advancing my years. I still go to work, and every day I want to try this. I want to try that. And of course, I now am at a stage where I'm compelled to write and document these things. Now, in the guidebook, which I learned today, they might advance the publication date to November. Because I finished my writing. By the way, in writing, I had mixed feelings. I wrote the draft, but they assigned an editor who wanted to make it a little bit more readable, meaning a little bit more popular. When I read certain sections, I cringe because he changed the tone to be more of a story. Be that as it may, I hope the readers will overlook that. And I try to, in the second book, Keith, organize it into these different stages of going from a lean startup where you're pulling your creativity in all these domains, going to market, articulation of your offers, hiring the first few people, how do you hire them? Everything is geared to being lean and minimalist, so to speak, but with a lot of punch. A lot of punch. But when you're minimalist, you get involved. And that is an important part of the journey because the founders, I believe, need to remain involved for far longer than they might anticipate at the beginning. Now, there are some people who jump from one startup to another, to another, to another, so-called really serial entrepreneurs. In some sense, I've done that, but I tried to complete each phase as much as I could. I think that involvement is an important part, and also, Keith, exciting, because one can call implementation dry, but I found tremendous amount of creativity in implementation. In fact, so much so, my rule of thumb has been innovation follows implementation rather than the other way around. That gets me into an altogether different topic, but I will stop at that point, Keith. Turn to you again.
All right. Well, the book is beautifully written. You mentioned that your publisher did some work to make it maybe less academic than a former academic like you might come up with. And, it is a beautifully written book. I read the first one. The second one, of course, hasn't come out yet. And there were certain passages in it where, because I know you so well, I thought surely Kenan did not write that passage. So I looked, but it is wonderfully written. So I looked at the acknowledgments. I want to give a shout out to the co-author of yours you refer to as the ghostwriter. That is Lee Troxler. Lee, you
Yes.
deserve a thanks for doing a good job. And are you working with Lee on the second book as well?
Yes, I also turned to him. This time I had internalized his style a little bit more, so his edits were not as extensive. He kept number of the passages the same because I think I came closer to him. But yes, he was involved. And this time I had an excellent editor as well, overall editor, and she did a very good job. Elizabeth Kennedy is her name. So I think the second book seems to be even more streamlined, and hopefully it will be a helpful guidebook of thoughts, not advice, but thoughts.
All right. I'd like to ask one more question as we wrap up the interview, and it's a big question about artificial intelligence. Now, way back in 1984, when I went for the interview with you, you needed someone to lead up the artificial intelligence efforts. And at that time, I had an artificial intelligence and computer science background with a degree from MIT. And that was for 6 years what we did at what was then called CMD and then Kenan Systems. And my business card actually said on it, I think it said Expert Systems Group, even though I think I was the only one in the group at first. And looking back, and I think of those technologies that we use, the algorithms that we used, of course, they're long obsolete and nothing like what we have today with the machine learning algorithms and what's called today artificial intelligence is so different from what we did back in the 1980s. I mean, as you say in your book, we did the first artificial intelligence application for a New York money center bank all the way back in the 1980s. And you've referred several times in our conversations over the months about today's artificial intelligence. So, yeah, what would you say to our listeners about your view of artificial intelligence and how far things have come since you started working in that area? As a matter of fact, you mentioned the 1960s with cellular automata. What's your view about today's artificial intelligence?
Well, Keith, it is a big question. My first exposure was in 1962 when I took a course with Minsky, Arvind Minsky, and he was teaching a course in artificial intelligence, and the field had been named only in 1957. And I wish the event that happened at Dartmouth in 1957 had not come up with artificial intelligence. I always thought it was a bad name because it has intelligence, which we identify with human beings, and it is artificial. And I thought it demeaned, on the one hand, human beings, and it also demeaned intelligence, made it artificial. Intelligence is an inherent manifestation. So by saying artificial intelligence, I think the field created the separation between machines and human beings. Well, that's my philosophical part. But then I got into it in a very indirect way. I actually did a lot of work in the 60s on cellular automata. And my notion was that the brain is inherently cellular automata and that it achieves its function without centrality. It's really an entity of multiple entities interacting with each other, and each entity itself is decentralized. So I looked at it in organizational terms. How can a decentralized, clustered entity do all the things it does? Anyway, that got me into networks and so on and so forth. And then came my after graduation life in academia. I got involved in my teachings, which were much more mundane, much more down to earth. And then in 1977, I had the great opportunity to be a visiting professor at MIT's electrical engineering. And I worked with Dartussos, who was really a promoter of the internet. And he was the guy who recruited eventually Tim Berners-Lee. That's when I worked on expert systems. And then in the 80s, when I was trying to present some of these pontifications, I came into contact with Citibank and presented expert systems, which eventually became part and parcel of their funds transfer systems. But now to answer your question more directly, Keith, what was lacking in the 70s, and I did some work in natural language processing, I did work on routing and cellular automata, was knowledge. It became very clear that you cannot have intelligence without knowledge. And you'll remember people like Seymour Papert were looking at kids to see how they learn and how they become intelligent. And it became evident that they acquire world knowledge. But how do you have a computer acquire world knowledge? That's very difficult. You have to write programs. You have to insert that into the computer's so-called memory banks. But the big breakthrough unexpectedly came via the internet. And when companies' search engines were developed very rapidly, there was Mosaic and later on Google, and there were many other search engines, they began storing massive quantities of knowledge, massive. And when people started creating their websites, something that couldn't have been imagined in the 70s and 80s happened. That is, the entire human civilization started putting their local knowledge on the internet. Who would have guessed that this would happen so quickly? And Google, of course, scanned libraries. And come 2010, 2015, human civilization's knowledge base was substantially put online. And overlay on that, the cellular computers, call them a multimodal, call them cellular, multiprocessor, many different names, combine the two, and now you had the knowledge base of the human civilization that each human being, by creating their own websites, including you, made part of this knowledge base. And then I think some of the algorithms that were developed in 2012, 13, 14, which created a different form of knowledge processing, call it a new form of intelligence, but it's a new algorithm, new set of algorithms. And now we have ChatGPT and all these new forms of artificial intelligence In some, let's call it general intelligence. In some sense, Keith, I could see that in 1960s because I was looking at the intersection of cellular, automata, algorithms, expert systems. What was lacking was knowledge. And in some sense, the pieces have come together. And just like human beings, which have vast amount of world knowledge, we have the modern artificial intelligence. I want to call it extended intelligence, not artificial. There's nothing artificial about it. Extended intelligence. And I view us human beings as hybridized by extended intelligence, just like cars extended are self-driving. We get into a car, we think we drive the car. We don't drive the car. We just turn the wheel and push a few knobs. Substantially, the car drives itself, the engine, the wheels, and all of that. And now that was extended mobility, cars. And now we have extended intelligence. And I think it's a very exciting era. Is it scary? Of course it is. Will people suffer? Well, cars kill about 30,000 people a year in accidents, transportation. Will there be victims of this? No matter what. And we have to come up with safeguards and all of that. But Keith, as some call it, it is almost like a different species that we have. I won't call it species, call it the intelligence hybridization era, just like the industrial age was the engine hybridization era. Human beings became hybridized with airplanes, with cars, and so on. Then there was the communication hybridization, which was ushered in by telephones and smartphones and so on. Now we're in, let's call it the final frontier, intelligence hybridization, which I call extended intelligence. And it's an exciting era, but it's also a very volatile era. So that's why, very long-winded, Keith, you got me into one of the key topics of my life these days, this domain.
Right. Well, and all the way back to 1962, your life, starting in artificial intelligence before, well, as you say, 5 years after the field was named. And yes, I'm familiar with that story, John McCarthy and the Dartmouth Conference. And Marvin Minsky was my own undergraduate thesis advisor in 1982 when I graduated. Well, Dr. Kenan Sahin, it's a pleasure to talk to you. It's one of the great things about having a podcast is that I get to interview incredible people like yourself with your academic successes, but in particular with your company successes, and then your new book, which is Lean Startup to Lean Company to Rich Exit. And then you have a second book, which is the Lean Startup to Lean Company, Rich Exit, the guidebook, coming out in a few months. And I'm going to have information about those books in the episode notes, and I'll put links to all of the information that Dr. Sahin has brought up in our interview. So, Dr. Kenan Sahin, thank you so much for being on The Science of Creativity.
Dr. Keith Sawyer, let me conclude by making the following observation, again, to take us to the beginnings. When I interviewed you and later on had the pleasure of working with you, I discovered something that is very relevant to what we're talking today. That is, you are one of those individuals who can go from creativity to excellent implementation with impact. And why do I say that? Because very early on, you went to Citibank and came back with your, what we at that time called knowledge engineering. And the document you produced was nearly perfect. I could not see any grammatical or spelling errors. And so fast forward to early 90s when you said you were leaving, which on the one hand disappointed me. On the other hand, you indicated that you wanted to pursue your doctorate and academic career. I could see that you would be a stellar success because you do have that creativity on the one hand and converting it to something that is tangible. Now you have what, dozen books, Keith?
Oh, yes, many books. So I won't give the number. You will catch up with me, I'm sure.
I won't, Keith. And you are still very young. Remember, the life expectancy for people in your age bracket is well over 100. You have decades of professional life ahead. So I wish you much luck in increasing that 10 to a many multiple, augmented by extended intelligence that really hybridizes what you're doing so that you can make even a greater impact. Well, many thanks, Keith. It's been a pleasure interacting with you. And thank you for many insightful questions.
Thank you for listening to this interview with Dr. Kenan Sahin. I worked with Kenan from 1984 to 1990, and it was an exciting time. In 1984, very few people had heard the word entrepreneurship, and even fewer people had heard the term artificial intelligence. Our company was based right next to MIT in Kendall Square, and that's because MIT was one of the few universities that had professors and students doing AI. Now, AI is on everyone's lips, and entrepreneurship drives economic growth to a level it didn't back in the 1980s. But one thing hasn't changed, and that's the essential role of creativity in generating knowledge and in improving lives. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.